Right. Okay. I tell you what, I'm going to start speaking because I feel like I'm the least important part of this of this webinar, and I will give the people coming in at this point will not miss anything by missing my comments, but we'll hopefully set up the DNV team nicely. So listen, I'm Ed Reed. I'm the editor of E-FWD, and I'm really excited to welcome you to this special presentation of DNV's Energy Transition Outlook 2025. DNV launched the report in February, and I was as an excellent event in London, which, in addition to the hosting the crack DNV team, also featured Dan McGrail, then of Renewable UK, but now, of course, at home, at least temporarily in GB Energy. And he was on stage, and it was very interesting to hear him speaking just before that appointment about some of his perspectives about the UK's energy trajectory. But it was also clear at the time that there was a political challenge. At that point, we were sort of, it was, I think, sort of early February, and it was a few days into the Trump presidency, and we'd begun seeing signs that the US was going to push back against those, I suppose, those lofty Inflation Reduction Act energy transition plans that the previous administration had set out. But since then, it feels like the politics have become tougher. I said, we've seen the sort of extent of those sort of challenges in the US, but also we're seeing them domestically. The Conservatives seemingly kind of moving away from net zero, although it's still a bit unclear about quite what their policy plans are. And of course, the rise of reform in the local elections. And there are vulnerabilities within the UK's clean power and sort of broader energy transition plans. It feels to me primarily these are about high prices and the complexity of the market, which kind of obscure what drives prices, in addition to factors such as constraint costs and the insanity of having to turn off generation at peak times. You could have asked though, what's the alternative? And it seems to me there are certainly ways to tinker with market design, although if I never hear mention of zonal pricing again, it would be too soon. But it's also clear that climate change is happening. I saw this morning a video of a glacier in Switzerland collapsing and destroying a village. And that's clearly caused by higher temperatures. And there is a real impact on people's lives, right? Which is, really at the heart of everything. And I feel like this is one of those areas where the recent move against ESG has been infuriating. In its original inception, those three letters were talking about the risks that we face. And given climate change, we should all be thinking about what impact that might have on our investment plans. And I feel that's been lost in the sort of the political hubbub. And if we want to think about how the UK is going to play a part, and if we want to think about how UK industry can play a part, I think we need good data. And I think that's really what DNV's Energy Transition Outlook offers. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Hari Vamadevan, VP of Energy Systems at DNV. Hari, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thanks, Ed, for that introduction and teeing us up nicely up. I'm actually not going to mention zonal pricing, but I can't guarantee that one of your listeners doesn't ask us a question on that. And a big thanks to the wider E-FWD team in the background for inviting DNV to share this platform. I'm going to give you a short intro, and I think you've actually set it up, because if you've been reading the news headlines for the past few months, I think it's surprising that we need to remind ourselves the biggest challenge the world faces is not tariffs or war, and by no means do I mean to diminish those as serious incidents playing out? Absolutely not. But I think, the biggest challenge the world faces is climate change. Yeah. And it's the energy transition. Now, DNV has been transitioning for a very long time. I mean, from its beginnings in maritime 160 years ago, we moved into oil and gas in the 1970s, renewables in the 1980s, and power grids in the 2000s. DNV is a trusted voice for risk and assurance services to the whole of the energy system. Through strategic acquisitions and continued investment, we've accelerated our growth across the energy system. And recently, you'll be happy to know, Ed, we made an acquisition of Ireland-based EnviroGuide for ecology, ESG, and biodiversity services, because there is more than one COP in town. Yeah. We've also taken steps towards a safe and just transition, investing to build a state-of-the-art energy transition collaboration centre at our facility at Spade Adam up by Hadrian's Wall, where we're doing cutting-edge research into the safety and performance of batteries, hydrogen and CO2. Now, at DNV, we totally believe in electrification as the key plank of the energy transition, but we also understand the energy system must be balanced to ensure a just transition. And this means a significant role for oil and gas for many years to come. Whilst everyone believes in the energy transition and net zero by 2050, or perhaps at least one day in the future, There's a big debate, as you've highlighted, Ed, on the speed and scale of the transformation of our energy system from the molecule to the electron. So rather than pick one or several predetermined scenarios, DNV decided to forecast the most likely path of the energy transition as a function of technology development. I always consider, Ed, that DNV is technology optimistic. And my long-term colleague, Frank Ketelaars, who you can see, he's our Energy Transition Director, and he'll be shortly sharing with you the highlights of our 2025 UK ETO report. The government has set out an ambitious new transition pathway that maps out 3 critical milestones towards our journey for net zero. And our report this year presents DNV's best estimate on UK emissions against those 3 targets. In the short term, Mission Control Clean Power 2030. In the medium term, the 2035 nationally defined contributions, often forgotten about, those promises that we make at the COPs for climate change. And then finally, the 2050 net zero target. But actually 2025 is already a pivotal year in our sector. We've seen record wind power generation, battery storage capacities expand significantly, and electric vehicle adoption showing signs of recovery, although I would say maybe the last couple of months that's maybe not as quite as strong as recovery as we had hoped for. But I think the past year does demonstrate the UK's potential on this transition journey. A decarbonised energy system will be cleaner and cheaper than one based on fossil fuels, but it is a mosaic, and you will need many energy vectors to meet demand. Yes, a substantial growth of renewables and power grids is a given, perhaps even a place for nuclear, but it's worth noting oil and gas will remain dominant in the energy mix till 2040, and we'll need CCS and hydrogen infrastructure if we're going to decarbonise that sector. The green economy does promise jobs, enhanced energy security, and technological leadership. But these opportunities can only be realised through continued policy support, strategic investment, and strong collaboration across all the sectors. The path ahead is challenging, but clear. We have to maintain our momentum while being agile enough to adapt to the new technologies and opportunities. And this is where whole system thinking is really important. Together, we can build an energy transition that's clean, balanced, and more efficient. A place where energy, the economy, industrial strategy, and security are actually all working together for the same goals. Now, discussions like the one we're having today are important because it's important that we remind ourselves we don't exist in a vacuum just talking to people within the sector. We need to take collective steps to get to where we know we need to be by 2050. Now, outside of this virtual room, you might find some folks that question the urgency of the energy transition and the net zero target. And as you highlighted, Ed, in your introduction, we see this in the political debate around net zero becoming more polarized, and at times, quite surprisingly, in the last couple of months, pretty toxic. But I suspect most of the people listening will agree, actually, we can't apply the brakes, and slow things down. Our climate is changing and our emissions are at a record high. So to address all of this and to get the energy transition moving, it's really important we de-risk the technologies that are there. We know that identifying and mitigating the risk will help deliver the projects we need to accelerate the transition. Technical due diligence will ensure the technologies we need are in place, viable and scalable. Transactional risks like regulatory and financing issues can delay or derail a project if they're not managed well. And project assurance can deliver projects on time, within budget, and with the expected level of performance. And then there are commercial risks that need to be adapted to. As you've mentioned, Ed, fluctuating energy prices, but also the market demand that really impacts long-term profitability. Together, addressing these factors builds investor confidence, accelerates deployment, and creates a more sustainable transition to clean energy. And my colleague, Viken Chinien, who you can also see on the screen, Head of Enterprise Risk Management, will talk quite a bit about de-risking in more detail. Now, there is a prize waiting for us. There is a greener, more resilient energy economy that costs less and will support both climate and consumer goals. But this opportunity won't come to pass by itself. We need to grasp it now with both hands and to bring different stakeholders together, not separate them, not make the conversation more polarized. Yeah. And it's important we're on the right side of history. And finally, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that if there was no risk, there'd be no reward. And where there are risks, there are opportunities. And I know this is going to sound slightly cheeky, but where there is also risk, there is DNV to trust. Now, to look at this year's UK energy transition outlook in more detail, Frank, if you'd like to go ahead and share the slides. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Frank Ketelaars. He's the co-author of our UK Energy Transition Outlook report. And Frank, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Let's make sure. Yeah, microphone. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. As Hari says, sort of in the next 20 minutes, I'll be giving you an overview of our key findings from this year's Energy Transition Outlook report. It's actually the third issue of our report. And since the last issue a year ago, we've actually been engaging with many stakeholders across the UK energy system, to discuss, to challenge and validate our assumptions. And this 2025 update reflects many of these inputs. But before I present the 2025 target, let me just get my CRO slide. That's right. Before I present the 2025 findings, I'd like to start by giving a bit of background to DNV's General Energy Transition Outlook report and model globally. So our global outlook report was issued the first time in 2017, so it's now in its 8th year. And as Hari mentioned, it gives DNV's view of the most likely development of the global energy system between now and 2050. And our approach is to give a single forecast. So we're not developing scenarios to cover a range of outcomes or trying to reflect a desirable net zero future. It's a single forecast, which in our view is the most likely outcome based on current technology developments, costs, energy demands, and policies. And this UK report, of course, builds on the global effort, but it reflects the specifics of the UK energy system. And even though it's a standalone assessment for the UK, it is part of the global outlook model because, of course, the UK is linked to the global energy system through things like technology trends, economic factors, and availability of energy sources. The key decisions in the models around technology uptake are driven by costs. So cheaper technologies attract more investment. And we're also for developing technologies, we're trying to reflect the impact of learning curves as we see costs reducing as we are installing or deploying more of the new technology. But we also know things in the short to medium term that we actually implement in the model, but things that we know that the UK is committed to. For example, the phase out of internal combustion engine sales by 2030, 2035, and also the current commitment of the government to the industrial clusters in terms of actually supporting some of the hydrogen and carbon capture projects looking forward. So how do we approach this? How do we actually look at this in terms of developing our outlook? We go through a number of steps. We actually start on the demand side. We actually assess the overall expected UK energy demand, taking into account things like GDP growth, population growth, and also the development of energy use in the different energy sectors. And based on this demand profile, we then look at the supply side. What primary supply do we need in terms of actually meeting this demand? And again, we look at what are the available resources, supplies we have, what is the current infrastructure, and what are the available technologies we could use. Once we have supply and demand, we look at what's in the middle. How do we actually produce, generate this energy, and how do we actually then transport it and deliver it to the final energy customer, defining the energy infrastructure. Once we have all of that, then we of course can translate this into investment costs. What capital investment do we need? And also, in the end, what does it mean to the final consumer in terms of what will be the cost to the final average consumer in the UK? And when we have all of this picture, of course, then we have the emissions profile, and we can compare this against the various targets we have set over this period between now and 2050. And as Hari mentioned, actually in the past, in the last few forecasts, we mainly focused on the long term in terms of what will the energy system in the UK look like in 2050. This year, we actually decided to actually look at it specifically and look at three specific time horizons and comparing our forecast against these three different targets. And each of these targets is driving towards net zero, but it has a different timeline and different challenges. So short term, mission control, clean power 2030 to decarbonize the UK electricity system by 2030. Medium term, delivering on our Paris agreements in terms of the nationally determined contribution by 2035, reducing emissions by 81%. And finally, still our long-term legally binding net zero target. So each of those I will quickly run through now in terms of what we see as the key outputs for these targets. So first target, mission control, clean power 2030. So this target aims to decarbonize the UK electricity system by 2030. And actually over this period, this time period, actually the electricity demand only increases by a small amount, about 15%. The larger electrification growth will actually come later. So for this target, the focus is very much on the supply side, that we can build out and connect sufficient low carbon electricity generation to meet today's, to replace today's 100 terawatt hours a year approximately of gas-fired generation, the expected demand growth, which is about 45 terawatt hours a year over that period, and finally also actually replacing some of the nuclear capacity that will be decommissioned between now and 2030. Overall, seeing and to meet these three things, we actually have to then build out the capacity. So today we in the UK have about 45 gigawatt of installed capacity, roughly equally split between onshore wind, solar, and offshore wind. And in order to meet this target, the government set an ambitious target to double onshore wind, treble solar, and quadruple offshore wind, which would actually result in a total installed capacity of 135 gigawatt. Our forecast actually says it's more likely in the next 6 years that we will double, more or less, the capacity of onshore wind, solar, and offshore wind, reaching about 90 gigawatt of renewable capacity by 2030. And even though it's a significant increase from today, it actually would be about 45 gigawatts short of the government target. For onshore wind, actually, we do see close to doubling of the capacity in line with target. If we can resolve some of the issues of permitting and planning, and also very much relying on repowering all the wind sites in order to increase their output, we feel that the target of doubling onshore wind seems doable. And actually, onshore renewables are currently the most cost-efficient way of generating electricity. And in our latest forecast, both in the UK and globally, we've actually seen a bit of a shift away from offshore wind towards onshore solar and wind, mainly very much driven by significant cost increases we've seen on offshore wind projects over the last few years, and potentially some supply chain issues around global competition for resources to build out this large amount of offshore wind capacity. And as a result of this predicted forecast of 90 gigawatt of installed capacity, and with only marginal impact of carbon capture over that time period, the UK will, in forecast, still rely for 12% of its electricity generation on gas-fired generation. So falling short of the government target, but a significant reduction. So before we move on to the next target, maybe something else we just should consider when we look at this target. Even though this, of course, this Clean Power 2030 is a key step on the way to net zero, it only addresses part of the challenge. Because even by 2030, only about 20% of our energy will actually delivered to customers in the form of electricity. The remaining 80% will still be delivered in the form of actually fossil fuels. This is then mainly gas for heating our homes and oil for fueling our transport system. So when we're really trying to achieve the targets for 2035 and 2050, the focus really has to shift more towards electrification of the demand side of things. So we actually electrify the demand and reduce the reliance on fossil fuel as a final demand carrier. So when we look at our 2035 target, under the nationally determined commitment under the Paris Agreement, we are committing to reducing our emissions by 81% by 2035. So what does it actually mean? So today, the UK's emissions are about 400 million tons a year of CO2 equivalent, as per the sources that's sort of shown in this slide. And really, in order to achieve this target, we actually have to reduce those emissions by 62%. And to put it into perspective, it actually took us nearly 35 years to reduce our emissions by 50% from 1990 levels. So a very tough target. And that's reflected in our forecast. We forecast actually that we only achieve about half of this, about a 35% reduction in emissions over that period. We do actually achieve a fully decarbonized electricity generation system by that period. But some of the other emitting sectors are lagging behind significantly. And this really reflects that accelerating the electrification of the demand side of the equation is a big challenge. In contrast with electrifying supply side of the equation, electrification demand side requires really engagement and buy-in from the final energy consumer, which is basically the public at large. So that's a very large and a very varied stakeholder group, which needs to be incentivized, convinced to install electric heating and switch to EV cars. So in the building sector, we only forecast a 12% reduction in emissions over this period. And it's very much driven by a lack of penetration of heat pumps to replace our reliance on gas boilers. And because in our forecast, based on current costs and subsidies, we forecast that still 24 million homes in the UK, so nearly 75% of homes, will still be using gas-fired heating in 2035, and only 4 million homes will have heat pumps installed. On the transport side, we see a slightly more pronounced reduction, a 25% reduction, as mainly driven by significant electrification on the car passenger road segment. However, it's clear that even with sort of the current sort of incentive for car manufacturers to incentivize and to promote EV sales, and with the expectation that EV costs will come down, become to parity with fossil fuel cars over the next 5 to 10 years, it will take a very long time to replace the existing vehicle fleet. And in 2035, based on our forecast, we forecast still 60% of all cars on the road will still be fossil fueled and resulting in significant emissions. On a positive note, we actually do see through significant rollout of carbon capture and hydrogen production by 2035, we see that we more or less will be, we see our industrial emissions reducing by about 50%, getting close to where we need to be in terms of targets. So then we look at our final target, a net zero target. We forecast that the UK emissions will actually still be 145 million tons a year by 2050, which is significant, 82% reduction, but not reaching net zero. And in a way, we've seen the exploration of the trends in 2035, that the transport and the building sectors are the major remaining emitters in 2050, linked to continued fossil fuel use in commercial transport and heating for homes. In the transport sector, we see that still a sizable proportion of especially commercial vehicles will be fossil fueled by 2050, and aviation will continue to have significant emissions due to the slow penetration of low carbon fuels such as e-fuels and hydrogen by 2050. In the building sector, even so again, based on current costs and subsidies, we find that the natural gas will still account for about half of the total building demand, primarily for space heating for more than half the UK homes, even in 2050. However, even though we're sort of not meeting the 2050 targets, we actually see some 3 long-term, I would say, very positive trends that actually have remained pretty stable over the last 3 years that we have done this forecast. Firstly, we actually see that UK final energy demand no longer grows in lockstep with GDP growth and population. In fact, energy demand in our forecast is reduced by 25% compared to today levels by 2050. Secondly, we see this continuous shift away from fossil fuels, from about 75% of primary supply today being fossil fuels, reducing to about 34% by 2050. And finally, the long-term picture shows that the decarbonisation of the UK economy should be affordable, and in the long term will actually reduce average household bills significantly. And I will sort of go through each of these things in a bit more detail in the next few slides. So firstly, it's the demand reduction. So our forecast shows that even though we still see significant growth in GDP, about 1.3% a year, and population, about 10% growth by 2050, we actually forecast that overall energy demand will reduce by nearly a quarter by 2050, mainly driven by large-scale efficiency improvements caused by electrification across all sectors of the economy. The chart here actually shows how our demand develops in the UK over time as a function of the final energy carrier that's delivering the energy to the customer. And you can see here there's a clear shift in how energy is delivered to customers, transitioning from fossil fuels as a key carrier to electricity as the key carrier for the future. Today, 3/4 of all demand is delivered to customers via fossil fuels, as I mentioned before, mainly for buildings, heating our homes and fueling our transport system, and only 18% today of our demand is delivered in the form of electricity. By 2050, that electricity will nearly cover 50% of demand, very much driven by large electrification in the roadside and partial electrification in the buildings heating side. But fossil fuels will still be there and delivering 40% of final energy demand, as I mentioned before, mainly linked to still heating our homes and transportation for aviation and commercial transport. So electrification is a key part of the demand reduction. So what does that look like? So we see significant growth of our energy demand, electricity demand, a factor of 2.3 increase between now and 2050. Today, about 300 terawatt hours a year of generation increasing to close to 700 terawatt hours a year by 2050. And what we also can see in this chart is that it's very much greening. From today, about a mix of low carbon sources provide about 63% of the electricity generation be fully decarbonized by 2035. And also what you can see here is that it's very much driven by an extraordinary growth of the variable renewables. Today, they provide about 100 terawatt hours a year of generation. It will increase to about 520 terawatt hours a year in 2050, so more than five-fold increase. And just to sort of put it in perspective, today we have 45 gigawatt installed capacity. By 2050, we will have close to 225 gigawatt of installed renewables, about 75 gigawatt of offshore wind, 55 gigawatt onshore wind, and close to 90 gigawatt of installed solar. So very much providing that sort of clean supply that we need. The second clear trend is that the positive trend is that the primary energy supply in the UK will be shifting continuously away from fossil fuels. Today, about 75% of our primary supply comes from fossil fuels, of which roughly half of it's produced in the UK, half of it's actually imported. And this will reduce continuously over the next 25 years to about 34% in 2050. But even with our predicted significant build-up of variable renewables, the heavy reliance on fossil fuels will remain for the next decade. And as Hari mentioned already, really, it's only reduced to 70% by the early 2030s and only reaching 50% of our primary supply by 2040. So there's this long tail of of fossil fuel use over the next few decades. And really, because of that, our forecast shows a significant need for mitigating technologies like carbon capture and hydrogen to still achieve significant emission reductions over that period. In our forecast, carbon capture plays a key role to reduce emissions, reaching about 40 million tons of CO2 capture capacity by 2035. In the short term, mainly driven by the committed government support, about 20 billion pounds of OPEX support by government, as we can see in sort of now finally seeing some FIDs coming through for carbon capture projects. But in the medium term as well, driven through expected increase in the carbon price in the UK and EU. That's so by the early 2030s exceeding maybe $150 a ton, that at that stage, the cost of emitting carbon will actually be higher than the cost of carbon capture. Hydrogen will have a key role to play to decarbonize the hard-to-abate industrial sectors, and through its derivatives, ammonia and methanol, reduce emissions from maritime and aviation. And our forecast actually shows that hydrogen will be responsible for 10% of the final energy demand by 2050. So a key role to play. But however, I would say for hydrogen, the commercial model is not as clear-cut. UK still needs to develop a good business model here for the hydrogen market, based on actually understanding what will be driving the real hydrogen demand in the UK, and determine where it's actually essential or economic to incentivize hydrogen production capacity. So finally, then look at the investment side of things. So we actually have looked at what were the investment in the energy system in the UK for the last 30 years and the next 30 years, and we're comparing the two. So in the last 30 years, the UK spent an average of £28 billion a year on its energy infrastructure. That will increase over the next 30 years to an average of £50 billion a year. So that's a significant, in absolute terms, a significant increase, about 80% increase. But what we've also done is actually plotted this spend against GDP over the whole period. And what you actually see that over that whole period, it actually remains about 1.3% of GDP. So in other words, the energy transition should be affordable. If we can find the right business models, if we can find the right access to capital, the necessary future investment is actually similar to what we spent in the past on our energy system. Of course, we see a shift on how it's spent. In the past, 50% of our spending was on fossil fuels to build and operate the UK offshore and onshore oil and gas systems. That's going to be less than 5% going forward. And in the future, really 60% of our spend will be on power, adding power generation, mainly dominated by renewables, and actually an investment in our grid system, both to actually reinforce our existing grid and build out new grid infrastructure to meet the electricity demand by 2050. So finally, then we actually looked also what this means for the average household. And we actually think, as Hari mentioned, there's actually a substantial green price for the UK economy to have a cleaner, more efficient and less expensive energy system going forward. This chart actually shows the average total household spend compared to 2021 levels. So before the Ukraine energy crisis, and this covers them both fuel transfer, road transportation cost, and things in the home. And what you can see that over the next in the next few years, we still expect the prices to be above 2021 levels, as we are still recovering, as Europe is still recovering from the UK gas supply crisis. But then we see actually continued reduction of average annual household spend, mainly driven by efficiency improvements by having an electrified system, both for road transportation and for heating our homes. So overall, we actually forecast, but by 2050, average household costs will be about 40% lower than they were in 2021. And actually, we think, and this of course is all based on current costs, but there's further reductions could be achieved if we do manage to decouple our gas and electricity prices. As you probably all know, electricity is still being about 4 times the price of gas per kilowatt hour. And if we can get further potential penetration of things like heat pumps to further electrify our system. So, but even with relatively conservative assumptions, this still looks like a significant reduction in spend, in average household spend. So, in summary, just a few things. Even though we don't meet the ambitious government targets, we see positive developments for each timeline. For the clean power target, we do see a doubling of renewable generation capacity, with mainly some concerns about the likely build-out rate of offshore wind over that time frame, mainly linked to cost increase and potential supply chain issues. And even though we're 45 gigawatts short of target, we've actually managed to reduce our reliance on gas-fired generation by 2/3 to about 12%. For the 2035 target, we managed to reduce today's emissions by about 35%, about half the target, but it shows very much the challenge of delivering on demand-side electrification for heating and transport. We only see a 13% heat pump penetration by 2035, and still 60% of fossil fuel-driven cars on the road. The only positive thing that we see the industrial emissions actually are more or less reduced in line with government targets through use of carbon capture and hydrogen. For the 2050 target, we are actually reducing our emission levels, reducing our emissions by 82% compared to 1990 levels, but still leaving 145 million tons a year of emissions, mainly linked to oil products for heavy road and aviation transport, and gas heating by using gas is still 50% of the homes. But then 3 very positive trends we can build on. Significant demand reduction of 25% by 2050, a continued shift away from fossil fuels, be it a slow one, and in our view that the energy transition should be affordable with similar investment needs in terms of percentage of GDP in the past compared going forward, and a long-term resulting significantly lower consumer costs going forward. So that's one of the key things I want to leave it at, and I want to hand over to my colleague Viken Chinien, who will talk a bit more of how we actually can de-risk the energy transition here in the UK. So Viken, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and a very good afternoon to all of you. As Frank just outlined, you can see there is currently a big gap between the government ambition targets that we set to get to net zero, the 2030, 2035, 2050 target, and the reality on the ground. So where are we seeing these gaps? Frank actually showed right at the start a picture of the energy system, the kind of 4 pillars of the energy system. There's a supply side, there's a demand side, there's infrastructure that connects supply and demand, and there's the investment side. Actually, the gaps are across the whole part of the energy system. If we look at the supply side, we need to urgently increase the rate of deployment of low carbon technologies. On the demand side, we need to do 3 things, actually. We need to reduce overall demand. And how we do that, it is by increasing energy efficiency measures, by delivering circular solutions that minimize waste, and also importantly, by embedding lifestyle changes. Another aspect of the demand side is that we need to reduce peak demand through shifting of the peak load. And we do that through digitalization, through smart tariffs and smart grids. And finally, Frank touched a lot on this. It's really also about electrification of demand through increased penetration of EVs and heat pumps. On the infrastructure side that connects the supply and demand, we need significant investment to go into grid and storage solutions. You can build all the generation you want, it cannot deliver if it cannot connect. So reinforcing and expanding the grid must go hand in hand with a low carbon technology deployment, not years behind it and severely lag that connectivity. So how do we make all this happen? The answer is finance. We need finance to be channeled into all these different areas of the energy systems. And for that, you need to de-risk the investment landscape. We need to provide clear, stable, and long-term frameworks, but also frameworks that account for shifting realities on the ground. For example, if I give an example for offshore wind at the moment, there are very strong headwinds against offshore wind. In the next auction round, we need the CFDs or the contracts for difference to reflect actual market conditions and the inflationary risk as well. Having said all that, there's one overriding consideration that we should not lose sight of as we look to de-risk that investment landscape. And that is, we need to deliver an energy transition that works for us all. What do I mean by that? It means that we cannot afford a transition that solves one problem while creating or not addressing other challenges, such as the huge biodiversity crisis that we face today, the social impact of the transition, and the need for adaptation to climate change. So while we need to de-risk our approach to the energy transition, that de-risking should be comprehensive. It needs to address, and importantly, and very importantly, it needs to price in a broader and deeper set of risks and opportunities. So what does this risk and opportunity landscape look like? It comprises 5 elements that impact business performance, which I've outlined in the middle sort of the picture there. It's about operational, it's about climate transition, climate adaptation, nature, and social. Now, the extent to which these elements will impact business performance will depend on the nature of the operations, the value chain of the business itself, and also their physical asset locations. And on the next slide, I outline some of the key aspects under each of these elements. So if we take one by one, let's start with operational. That's core business. That's basically absolutely core to business performance. It is about delivering optimal asset performance safely and reliably to meet your revenue expectations. Actually, I can tell you today, under the current uncertain market conditions that we face, the calls that we are getting from a lot of our clients, investors, corporates alike, is to support them on further optimizing the asset performance because they want to maximize the yield from these current existing portfolios which they have. Overall, I would say these operational risks and opportunities are well understood and generally priced in the investment decision. I would highlight, however, two risks here, which are really increasing in importance: supply chain and cyber risk. And we think as DNV, when we look at it and how projects are looking at these risks and how investors are looking at these risks, it needs more detailed assessment to be effectively priced into these investment decisions. So that's operational. That's pretty much, sort of core to business and really take into account as we know it today. The next 4 are slowly emerging, I would say. Let's take climate transition, for example. Yes, low carbon technologies are low to zero emissions during operations, but let's not forget there's a whole life cycle around these assets. So we need to consider their impact across their whole value chain, from the extraction of critical minerals and rare earth elements that goes into building these components, the different components that comprise these assets, to also, very importantly, the end of life of these assets and the decommissioning. What happens to these components upon decommissioning? How much of these are actually recyclable today? So these areas are coming under really more and more scrutiny from both regulators and also investors, and that includes both equity investors and debt providers as well. And to be honest, we are doing a lot of work at the moment, a lot of due diligence work for these investors and also on behalf of regulators as well on these aspects to inform their investment decisions. But there's also opportunities in that space. The opportunities to build more circular solutions around recycling of these different components and minimize the waste that goes to landfill. There's also opportunities to access sustainable finance, but you need to demonstrate that sustainability across your value chain and not just during operations of those assets. The third one is really important. I mean, Harry already mentioned in earlier as well, climate change is already happening. We see it, every day. It's in the news. Over the last year, we see the high temperatures records being broken every single year, every single month, actually. And you see the floods, the drought, the wildfires, and everything, and so on. So how is the business adapting its operations to the increasing impact of climate change? And not just in direct operations, but also across the whole supply chain, because you need to build resilient. If you can't get your raw materials in, if you can't get your products in, you can't distribute it to your ultimate consumer, your revenue will be impacted. Also, on the more sort of like, if we take more on the wind side and the offshore wind side at DNV, we are now incorporating the impact of climate change in our energy yield forecast, as we see it having an impact on the overall energy production. We actually done a lot of work with clients, and they've come to us and asked us to do evaluation of exactly what is the impact on average wind speed from climate change. And from what we've done, the studies we've done in project where we carried out, we've seen variation of around plus or minus 1 to 2% in average wind speed. Now that correlates roughly to about 1 to 4% variation in energy production. And as you know, that will impact your revenue as well. Now, we need to caveat that this is very much project dependent and location dependent. Some places will have upsides, other places will have downsides as well. So you need really to be very sort of bespoke analysis in order to come to these numbers as well. The other thing we are going to include as well as we move forward in terms of looking at the impact of climate change is what is the impact of extreme wind speeds, for example. We've increased intensity and frequency in storms. We're looking at the impact of increased temperatures, really on the whole design envelope of those assets as well. What was a 100-year return period before, today is probably a 50-year return period. So how are your assets actually designed to withstand these increasing hazards as we move forward? Now, some of these factors are starting to be considered in projects, and we expect this trend to increase as investors and, importantly, really insurers as well are asking for pricing of these risks. And this will be reflected in the insurance premiums as well as we move forward. Nature, I mean, Harry mentioned a different COP. So there's this biodiversity COP that happens every 2 years. I was actually at the COP last year in Colombia as well. It is a huge, huge crisis that we are facing in terms of biodiversity. So in terms of businesses, it's really about understanding what are the impacts and dependencies of the business on nature. I already mentioned previously in relation to the transition risk about the impact across the value chain of extraction of minerals and also the end of life waste. We also need to consider the impact of infrastructure development on local habitats, on species, including migratory species as well. And importantly, this should not be done, as an afterthought, but right at the start of the design of every single project. A case in point, I mean, it was in the news as well. Everybody has heard about the bats in the news and the tunnel that cost 100 million, for HS2. End of the day, this wasn't considered right at the design of the project. So it needs to be embedded right at the start. Our enemies are not the bats in the news. It's really how do we actually move on the process to protect all this wildlife around us as well, which are all under serious risk at the moment. So the UK has mandated biodiversity net gain, or BNG, for onshore assets, and we are currently developing a marine net gain approach for offshore assets as well. At DNV, we're actually building our own tool for marine net gain, and that tool covers habitats, seabirds, and marine mammals. We piloted it last year with a couple of clients as well, and had very positive results. And what we are looking for now is to have a couple more pilots, and then we're looking to roll that out later this year. So moving forward, projects will need to demonstrate a nature positive approach to be considered favorably. So, but currently it is fair to say, I'm involved in a lot of due diligence and investment sort of M&A work as well, and looking at valuation models. It is fair to say that these risks are not fully priced in projects and investment decisions, but need to be accounted for as we move forward. And finally, social risk. I mean, this is probably among all these, that's one of the biggest risks that we face today. You need to bring people along with you. Otherwise, all this, we are not going to succeed. So we need to deliver a fair and equitable transition. We hear it every day in the news: affordability, delivering green jobs, reskilling, upskilling the workforce. All these are key elements that need to be addressed. So as a company, as a corporate, you need early engagement with these different stakeholders, including the local communities, including regulators, including the relevant NGOs, and these are key to mitigating the social risk and delivering positive social outcomes. In fact, actually, we do this, if you do this all well, it will also have significant positive reputational impact on the business as well. So these are the 5 risks. When we talk about de-risking the energy transition, you need to de-risk across this whole spectrum of risk. So to conclude, the imperative to act is really urgent and real if we are going to meet the targets. But the urgency in delivering that energy transition cannot come at the expense of everything else. We must de-risk the transition across the full spectrum to deliver climate resilient, nature positive, and socially progressive outcomes. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Hari for some closing remarks.
Big thanks, Viken, and a big thanks to Frank as well. And I hope you can see how DNV takes an incredibly holistic view of risk, both for the energy transition and for the biodiversity picture, the 2 COPs that run in parallel. There's lots of facts and figures that Viken and Frank have shared, and you'll be able to access all of those facts and figures. And I believe the Forward team has also put it in the chat box. You can scan the QR code and find all the details. But actually, that's one side of the picture. And at DNV, you've heard from Viken about the social mandate as well. And actually what we've done this year for the first time, if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see we've produced some videos. Yeah, because one is, and as I said, we're very much about technology deployment, which is facts and figures and engineering. And that's what the reports are for. But we also know it's hearts and minds and feelings about a just transition. So we produced 2 videos. The first launched a couple of months ago. It's an 8-minute video talking about the great transition. And that's already had almost 8 million views. But actually yesterday we launched my favorite, an 18-minute video that really captures more of the nuance and the challenges around whole system thinking and the transition and the social mandate for a just transition. So that launched yesterday. It's on YouTube. There's a QR code here to go and watch it. And on both the report and the video, we're really excited to take feedback. Not everyone agrees with us. And the reason we put it out there is to stimulate and have the discussion so that we can come together and find a way to make this energy transition both speeded up and just. So Ed, thank you for giving us the platform, and back to you and your team.
Perfect. Well, listen, thanks, guys. That was a really interesting presentation. I mean, I saw sort of parts of it earlier this year, and I really enjoyed both times. I've got a couple of questions. Obviously, we've got people watching. Feel free to drop a question into the Q&A chat box, and I can pick it up from there. And obviously also download the report, but obviously not right now. Hold on and submit a question. But listen, I'm gonna fire a question in, because I feel like in some ways the world has changed a bit since February, since the launch of the report. Maybe it's the news hound in me that's kind of always kind of looking at what's been kind of going on. But I feel like seeing Ørsted cancelling Hornsea a couple of weeks ago now. What does this mean? How do you think things are going sort of about halfway through the year?
Ed, I'll take that question, and look, it's a great question, because things change almost on a daily basis especially in the current political climate. I think there's 2 important things to factor in. So on one side everything's changed, and others nothing's changed. So we're a maritime history to DNV, so we look at waves and we look at currents. Yeah, so if you're a ship, and I would say since February the waves have got bigger and more frequent. So there's no question the landscape of financing, the landscape of understanding your demand has changed. And therefore you're seeing a slowdown in FID decisions, final investment decisions. No question the market has slowed down. Why? Because it sees uncertainty. It doesn't understand how to price in that uncertainty. And obviously they can give you a hand to price that uncertainty. So it's slowed things down. But the currents are completely unchanged. And that's why I love working for DNV. We're owned by a foundation. We take the long-term view. And there's only 2 currents. There's climate change and there's net gain biodiversity. So actually, if you're able to see your way through the short-term challenges. Easier said than done. The two currents will drive you forward because it's inevitable these projects have to happen to drive the transition forward and ensure we're taking care of the biodiversity. And my final comment would be, especially I suspect a lot of your listeners will understand this, shock horror, the energy sector is cyclical. Yeah, I'm old enough to have gone through quite a few cycles. So don't panic, understand the maths, understand your risks, and find a way to move forward.
And I suppose just sort of building on that, Harry, I'm going to stay with you for a moment, if I may. I mean, obviously, so Frank very clearly sort of set out that sort of, the DNV kind of view on sort of the UK's trajectory, which is really fascinating. And obviously, it's sort of falling short of the sort of, Clean Power 2030, right? And particularly since, the sort of the Orsted decision to drop Hornsey, but obviously there's been sort of mounting sort of like, sort of challenges to this kind of, 2030. Should Ed Miliband push it back? I guess what's the price of failure in kind of Clean Power 2030, right? What is the risk of failing to achieve those goals? Is it time to reconsider? I mean, you talk about wavering currents very, very, very powerfully, but in terms of sort of actually achieving those goals and then falling short, is that going to be a problem?
Gosh, you've gone on to one of my second favorite topics, which is to talk about targets and ambitious goals. Yeah, everyone in business, we're accountable, whether it's revenue, EBIT, delivering all the things we have to do. I am an optimist, so I subscribe to setting ambitious targets. And if you fall short, you have still achieved change. Yeah, so to set the targets, and ultimately, Frank showed you for 2050, we fall short by 145 million tons of CO2 being emitted, but an 82% is still an incredible achievement. So this is why it's a really difficult conversation to have on social media, because to set ambitious targets is to set yourself to have a risk of failure. Yeah. But I find, the ambitious targets that the current government has set out is the way to do it, is the way to drive change. The 20-odd billion pounds they've committed to CO2 moves the needle for carbon capture, which combined with a higher price of carbon will make the CO2 carbon capture projects happen. And that's how you can get a combination of stick and carrot, both the CFD and seed funding combined with the right taxation policy will drive the projects forward. So I'm all for ambitious targets. I don't see it as failure. I take the same view at DNV. Let's put some ambitious targets. Let's try to grow by 50% in the next 5 years. But please, if you're my boss, don't judge me if I fall short. So I don't see it as failure. It is and I actually see the reverse. It's the only way to get significant change. Otherwise, you'll get a world of incremental change, and that's 3 or 5%. And everyone can deliver 3 or 5% growth each year. You don't need fantastic leadership for that. What you need leadership for is to make the step function change, set the ambitious goals, and understand what happens if you don't quite reach them.
And then I suppose maybe for Frank, Viken, maybe this question is for you. I mean, I think looking at high prices obviously kind of plays into that kind of political challenges. I mean, I think Viken, those kind of columns you set out really kind of speaking to I suppose the sort of the social pressures. But to what extent do you think that high prices endanger that path towards decarbonisation?
I mean, in a way, the short, of course, we see it happening. I mean, I say the sort of shift away from offshore wind, very much driven through these high pricing. But I think long term, the trends are there in terms of once we sort of ride out some of these crises that we see now. I think so. But we've seen also in our global forecast as well. Over the years, we've done this now 8 times, and we've looked at things: the impact of COVID, the impact of the Ukraine crisis, maybe now the impact of tariffs. Overall, the trend, the endpoint has been pretty similar in a way, a bit disappointing in a way. We'd expect it to get better over time, but overall, the long-term trends are hard to change. I think so. So I do think in some ways, yes, we have to be aware of it, but I do think the thinking stays, and I agree with Harry in some ways. Also, the Clean Power 2030, in some ways, I mean, it's in a way, what do you call it? Even if you fall short, I mean, if you get to pretty close to it, it's not a lost investment. In the end, it will be cheaper, a better electricity system. So I think even if you fall short, it still is. If it's a year or two later, it's still a very good achievement, I think, and it still will help. So I think short term, the price issues are there, especially of course now on the whole, obviously the whole issue of the cost of living around, also what happens for the average household and pay for energy, it is of course a real issue. But it's good to see that the long-term trends actually will take you beyond that if you can actually deliver on this transition.
Just to add to that as well, I think, Ed, as well. I mean, this is a question. There's a lot of different dimensions to this. There's a political dimensions as well, because a lot of it will be dependent on a progressive sort of way of thinking about it and taxation and so on. There's a economic dimension to it, technology dimension, but also we are working with industry as well as looking at how to further reduce costs as well. That will obviously reflect into pricing in the future. And two of the things we are doing at the moment, we are running a joint industry project looking at standardization. And this is really important. The more you standardize, the more you can use the same type of vessel, the same types of platform, the more you can use the same type of spare parts for your equipment and so on, that you reduce your cost base. I mean, this is where the learnings from the oil and gas industry is really important about standardization, collaboration. For example, does every single wind farm, for example, need to connect point to point? Should be connecting to hubs, for example. How do you get the industry to collaborate pre-competitively and also thinking more broadly as well, so that then over time you can actually reduce these cost pressures as well and deliver an LCOE, levelized cost of energy, which is better for everybody as well, and that can be reflected in the pricing strategy. I mean, there's the oil and gas industry has had 150 years to refine its sort of collaborative nature and the way it works together as well. But I think the renewable sector as well need to find that pathway much quicker, but it can learn from what has happened in other industries as well to do that.
We've had some questions coming in. So, I mean, there's one here from Mohsen Hassanzadeh. Do you think if the UK increases its domestic gas production to meet the country's demand as much as possible during the energy transition period, it will reduce carbon emissions when we compare it to importing gas as LNG? I mean, it's this sort of the classic, is it better to produce our own gas? Hari, I see you're thinking about that one.
Yeah, I mean, Frank will give you some facts and figures, but the reality is, and our forecast shows that, oil and gas is still dominant till 2040 and then only reduces to 30% by 2050. So the question is how much oil and gas you need, not if you need oil and gas. And it's 16 billion barrels of oil equivalent of total oil and gas needed. And so the only question that remains is very much a political and economic question to the nation, which is how much do you want to make domestically? And 16 billion barrels of oil equivalent is much more than the North Sea can produce. So we are importing. That's just a fact. So that's why we need strong bilateral relationships to the sources of where that energy is going to come from. That's Norway and the rest of Europe for gas. And it's a lot of LNG imports coming from either the USA or the Middle East. So that's not an if, that's a definite. We will be importing oil and gas for the rest going forward. Now, what you could do is you could maximize the North Sea, but that becomes very much a political economic decision. And when it comes to understanding the carbon footprint, clearly distance has an impact. Yeah, clearly the rules and regulations around the oil and gas sector will have an impact. And you could argue that the North Sea should be the cleanest barrel of oil and gas that you can produce. So we will be importing. Whether you maximize domestic production is an economic and political decision for the country, but we will be importing forever.
Not forever. Not forever.
Well, until you no longer need oil and gas. Frank, I don't know if you've got any facts and figures to add.
No, but I think, as I say, and we also looked a bit. I mean, it would again not move the needle that much in the end, because we are a declining province anyway in terms of oil and gas production. So you could maybe do something in the short term, but long term the picture will look pretty similar, I think. So I wouldn't say it would be a sort of an emission reduction impact. I think it would be more, as Hari said, an economic decision, political decision. Where do you want to? The oil and gas you'll need, and because the other big challenge is very much how. Yeah, the bigger challenge is actually how will you reduce that reliance on oil and gas going forward for the next few years? And that's the other thing, a challenge mentioned around electrification of demand. So we can get to that later, maybe.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I think we're pretty much out of time. So, unfortunately, Frank, we'd love to chat longer, but we are perilously close. I mean, I'm just going to very cheekily just ask one question, just about risks, I suppose, right? What are the risks of that could knock plans off course, right? I think obviously, we sort of talked about politics a little bit, but in terms of sort of things that you are watching out for, what people, should be watching out for, are there any things in particular that you're like, oh, that may prove a challenge?
I mean, my personal view is still that actually the biggest risk is that we don't succeed in electrifying our demand. I think it's a very difficult problem. I think we can do a lot. We can throw a lot of effort, money, business models against the supply side, but the demand side is difficult. And that's not just the UK, it's a global thing. To make that happen is actually a key thing. How are you going to do that while you bring along the public at large and making a just transition? I think that's the biggest risk, actually. I don't think the supply side is the problem. I think the demand side is the problem. But anything else, Viken?
No, I agree. I think this is that social narrative, and also, to counter sort of misinformation, disinformation in the media around all these technologies and uptake of these technologies as well. I think that's a big thing that needs to be addressed. And you need independent bodies, you need trusted bodies to come with information in order for people and society to move forward. And that's where DNV is a trusted body, I would say.
Very nicely done. Very nicely done.
Very nice.
I mean, listen, guys. As I said, I would love to chat longer, and I'm sure that there will be further opportunities. But for the time being, I think we are pretty much out of time. So I want to say thank you, Hari, Viken, Frank. Really interesting ideas from everyone, and I think that kind of question around demand, I think, is a really interesting one to end on. I suppose, looking at those kind of numbers that you were showing up, Frank, around, sort of making progress on power, making progress on industry, but in terms of sort of, heat pumps just being far too slow. And it's those sort of individual decisions, isn't it, that sort of essentially families have to take. And it's so hard. I mean, electrifying a factory is challenging in some ways, but essentially it comes down to one person saying, let's go ahead with this. Whereas to get that sort of scale of decisions from individual housing is going to be a real challenge. And I think there's going to be a lot more kind of going into the kind of question around sort of carrots and sticks, around sort of efficiency improvements. But ultimately, yes, how do we electrify demand? A big question to end on. Obviously, glad to get your input. I'm sure we will hear more from your of your ideas next year. I hope we can look forward to an update to see how we've been getting along. But for today, for now, thanks very much. Thank you for tuning in. I've been Ed Reed. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for listening.